Welcome to Global Connections on ThinkTech Hawaii. I'm your host, Jay Fidell. Today we'll talk about diplomacy. Has diplomacy been lost under Trump? The debacle in the Oval Office signals, or could signal, the end of American diplomacy. Our guest for the show is Carl Ackerman. Dr. Carl Ackerman, author, teacher, and philosopher, if you don't mind. Welcome to the show, Carl.
Thank you, Jay Fidell.
The debacle in the Oval Office a week ago Friday makes us look more carefully on how diplomacy has worked and how it should work going forward, and maybe how it shouldn't work. So I think people will agree that Trump went off the rails of diplomacy in the debacle in the Oval Office. That was not diplomatic, Carl. But how far off the rails did he go?
Well, my suggestion for President Trump is that he goes and he reads the book by Henry Kissinger called Diplomacy, because what Kissinger outlines in this book is that American diplomacy has, been located under two camps. One sort of Bismarckian with realpolitik, and the other under Woodrow Wilson, with having high ideals and trying to implement them. President Woodrow Wilson. And and the former president of Princeton University. But according to John Bolton, his former national security advisor from his first term, Donald Trump does not operate that way. He operates in terms of just a real estate deal making, which is not akin to diplomacy.
No, it's not. It's real estate deal making could be anything you want it to be. The idea is to force the other guy to accept your position, which it's my primary theory on what he was doing that day. Do you agree that the way he set this up, the ambush quality, using the media, ignoring Zelensky's request for a security agreement, bringing in they call it the conservative press, having his whole staff there, and requiring Zelensky to speak English, which is not his first language. All of those were tricks and machinations to get Zelensky to agree to Trump's one-sided deal. That is, we get your rare earths and you get virtually nothing. Isn't that what happened?
Both J.D. Vance and President Trump were attempting to approach this land deal, and they didn't get there. And the reason they didn't get there, if you listen to the interview, not just the last 7 minutes where they're acting like morons, that is J.D. Vance and President Trump. But what's happening in that press conference in the first sort of 35 minutes or so is that President Zelensky is actually being very diplomatic, and they're talking about the case of Russia. And, of course, Trump goes off on different subjects. He's very concerned about the fact that he lost the political election to Biden. So he goes really off track. And then what happens is that, when they're talking about different specific historical issues, President Trump and J.D. Vance are ahistorical. And what President Zelensky was trying to say to them, because their big message was, okay, we're going to be an equal intermediary between, President Putin and President Zelensky. And President Zelensky kept saying, look, this guy, going back to the 1994 Budapest memorandum, we agreed to, ditch our nukes, and he was supposed to not invade our country, which of course he violated. And then again, after he had invaded, in 2014 and 2015, there are the Minsk Accords, and Putin again violates those accords, and in 2022, in February 22nd, he invades full force. So what President Zelensky was saying all along is you can't trust this guy, and you've got to go back to the history to figure this out. And both J.D. Vance and President Trump were using wrong dates, which President Zelensky had to correct. And so part of diplomacy is doing your homework. At what John Bolton said about President Trump is he listened to the last guy in the room, and he had no sense of thinking about the larger issues and having a set of strategic plans or ideas that he wanted to get across. And so this is the difficulty with our current president. And JD Vance was just feeling very defensive, and that's what started this all. And to say to another person, you should be thanking us. Um, uh, you know, when this person is fighting a war, is really is really something else again. So, there is no diplomacy under the Trump administration, with the exception of Marco Rubio. Marco Rubio is attempting to do um, uh, sort of diplomacy, and his work in Saudi Arabia today was quite great because he was able to allow the Ukrainians to come up with the idea that they will agree to a 30-day ceasefire. Well, I think the Ukrainians are ready to do this already, but so it was a win for the Ukraine. But as as our current Secretary of State said, this isn't a television game. This isn't I think he used the example of Bad Girls, or I guess that's a movie. He said this is serious stuff, and I think the problem is, and Jay, to address your original question, is I don't think JD Vance and President Trump think of diplomacy as serious stuff where you need to do your homework and think about things the way people in the State Department do. I mean, come on. I mean, where's the George Kennan here? Where's the Henry Kissinger? Where's the John Bolton? I mean, come on.
I keep thinking of the Loire Valley and the castles there. And the castles were built for diplomacy. They had the places that you could retire to, private rooms, places of assignation on the roof of the castle, where people were expected to talk privately and reach, deals or strategies that would create an agreement somehow. And so here we have a situation where Trump sets it up with the press there, live TV for the world, right? His staff there against this one guy that they're going to pound on. And he's got Marco Rubio, who I think was, as you say, he's much more diplomatic than Trump or Vance. He was really uncomfortable being there, and he had no role, except to agree with Trump. Poor guy. Really, I feel bad for him about that. And the press, the conservative press was there. All in all, it looked like an ambush, and I think that's the way the press called it. I mean, the press in general called it an ambush, and so Trump now had to find a way to back down because he looked so bad to the world about diplomacy, about the Oval Office. He was soiling it, soiling the traditions of diplomacy, soiling the Oval Office. And so that's why they're only too happy to make a 30-day ceasefire deal in Saudi Arabia. But, and he's done that so many times. You push like a bully, you get resistance, and then you change. And that's his kind of diplomacy. It's like a psychopathic type of diplomacy. If you can get away with it, you keep on doing it, and worse, if you can't get away with it, you find a way to reverse it and come up with some kind of excuse for reversing it. But I wanted to talk to you, Carl, about diplomacy in general, about the 17th century, about how it was, on the roof of the castle in the 17th century, speaking French, making peace, making deals on the roof. Isn't that where it all came from? I mean, the French kind of invented diplomacy. And when we use the word diplomat or diplomacy, we're really referring back to what they were doing in those days to try to create an environment where people would make agreements. And that has been the case, hasn't it? All through Europe and all through the world.
Klaus von Metternich, was the guy that supposedly was in charge of the Congress of Vienna to end the Napoleonic, rule in 1815. So I'm with you, Jay. And that Congress of Vienna, there wasn't a major war until 1914. So you could consider that a probably pretty good Congress, despite its faults. And then you did have, of course, heads of state that were there. And, this was a time when, the wealthy determined what was going to go on in the world. But in terms of diplomacy, this was pretty good. And of course, what's interesting about this is it was that Metternich, the Austrian diplomat, who really created the entire scene for this. And of course, he did his homework. And what's also interesting about this is that a young man by the name of Henry Kissinger, when he was at Harvard, wrote his dissertation. I don't know whether it was his BA thesis or his PhD. I think it was his PhD on Metternich. So I mean, what goes around comes around, and so and Henry Kissinger, despite I have a very good friend from Punahou School named Jay Seidenstein, and Jay used to walk into my room when I was lecturing, open the door briefly and say, Henry Kissinger is a war criminal, and then walk out because he knew I was a big, fan. Of course, I understand what Jay was saying about the Vietnam War, et cetera, et cetera. I wouldn't call Kissinger a war criminal, but I understood where Jay was coming from. But yeah, I completely agree with you. Let me just take it back to, one thing about what we were talking about. Now, remember I was talking about homework, and J.D. Vance has a cousin, and his name is Nate Vance, and they grew up together. And he's been in the front lines for 3 years on Ukraine. He thinks that JD's making a big mistake. And what Nate was, interviewed yesterday on CNN. I didn't know about this guy, quite frankly. And what a wonderful interview that was done with him. And basically he was saying is you can't trust the Russians. They operate by a different set of principles. And then what he said was, which I did not know, is that the Russians are using the old World War II thing that they did, is that if you're a Russian soldier and you retreat, they shoot you. The Russians shoot you. And, it shows you what kind of principles are operating on the Russian side. And, I go back to the notion that, Vladimir Putin is a Slavophile, and he's ex-KGB. And, what did the KGB do? The KGB defended the Soviet state. I mean, it was the apparatus like our CIA or our FBI that defended the Marxist-Leninist doctrine. And Putin's number one issue is the West, and the West politically to him is degenerate, terrible, and always threatening Russia. But anyway, I kind of went off on a tangent here. But the fact that that J.D. Vance didn't pick up the phone and talk to his cousin to get firsthand information is an example of what I'm talking about. I mean, these guys came into that diplomatic situation with President Zelensky, and you saw Trump at the beginning was very friendly, and Donald Trump, our president, but towards the end, when President Zelensky started challenging the historical authenticity and the notion that that you can deal with Putin. And what came to mind, Jay, because you were mentioning history, is what came to mind is Neville Chamberlain. And now Neville Chamberlain was a diplomat, a true blue diplomat from England, but he tried to appease Adolf Hitler. And what Zelensky was saying to both Donald Trump and to J.D. Vance is, you cannot appease. You cannot. Now, he didn't use the word appease, but you can't appease Vladimir Putin. You need to go to him by strength. Let's put European troops on the ground if we're going to have this kind of settlement, which I think is necessary, much less U.S. troops, although I'd hate to see us get involved in a war where our people are going to be sacrificed. But I think if we lose the Ukraine, that's going to happen anyway. But anyway, I'm going to stop.
I don't think these guys would agree with you about that. I think that inherent in their position is that we can afford to lose Ukraine, and we can trade off Ukraine for some kind of improved relationship with Putin, which is ephemeral at best. But I wanted to go back to the Pax Americana for a moment. It seems to me, after Neville Chamberlain, after the war, we were smarter, and we have been watching, both domestically, where we had a problem about entering the war, and internationally, where we realized that, as Golda Meir says, and which with some total accuracy, She said, you can't negotiate with somebody who is dedicated to kill you, which is, the statement of the Israeli position for many years. And so Pax Americana included, may I say, diplomacy. Part of the reason why the U.S. was so influential, there were many reasons. One, it was a victor in the war and it saved Europe and it saved Asia. But aside from that, we were following the rules of diplomacy. We had the Kennedy Center. We had all these people, dedicated to diplomacy in the highest order. And that was the emblem of our country, of our morality, of our international relations. We were the home of the UN. We were the founder of the UN, or one of the founders. And so I think diplomacy has been inherent in the US participation in the international conversation for many years. And what we have now is Trump turning his back on all of that, operating outside the norms. And I guess the first question I would ask you is, it seems clear that he was operating outside the norms, and Vance operating outside the norms. They were not prepared. They were not diplomatic. They didn't follow any of the rules on how you deal with leaders of other states, good or bad. But Zelensky couldn't tolerate the lies. He couldn't tolerate the exaggerations. He couldn't tolerate what Trump was saying. And Vance came to Trump's help to change the subject and attack, Zelensky, and then Trump attacked Zelensky. My question to you, put yourself in Zelensky's skin for a moment. Was he being diplomatic? Could he have done a better job? Should he have let the lies go unanswered?
I don't think so. I think that he acted like the perfect diplomat. The only time I saw him get a little ruffled was when one of the press members said to him during the longer press conference, "How come you don't wear a tie and a suit when you come and visit? There are a lot of people in the United States that kind of expect you to wear a suit." He said, very diplomatically, maybe after the war, when I'm not called into combat areas and things like this, pretty frequently. He didn't say that, but that was assumed. And the only time I saw him be a real ruffled, he looked up at the guy in the suit and said, "Well, maybe after the war I'll get a suit and it'll probably be a better suit than yours, and although it'll probably be less expensive." And so I thought that was kind of a good response to that kind of obnoxious. I mean, they're talking to him about a suit when people are dying on the ground and things like this. And the getting back to what you were talking about at the historical look. I mean, we had people like George Kennet, who wrote about containment in that famous State Department X article, and which was basically then followed by an article in the New York Times by a quite famous Russianist at UC Berkeley named Martin Malia, who wrote a Z article and said, and this is the way people did this. You write articles for the State Department and Foreign Affairs and things like this, and maybe your ideas get picked up by president. And of course, we had Harry Truman, who started the Truman Doctrine because with this idea of containment. And then you mentioned the Kennedys. I mean, can you imagine a nuclear war? I mean, and what all the generals were advising JFK and RFK and Robert Kennedy to bring out the nukes, and luckily cooler heads prevailed, and they set up a telephone frequency between the White House and Moscow, between Nikita Khrushchev, and because these are two Harvard-educated, very smart guys, we prevented World War III, and this has been the case. And I mean, if you look at from our former president Biden to other presidents like basically Bill Clinton and Al Gore and stuff. These guys are bright guys. Those guys were Rhodes Scholars, and they know how to use diplomacy, and they know how to pick people. And it's no accident that President Barack Obama picked one of the brightest people that he could, Hillary Clinton. And Hillary Clinton's very Akamai and brilliant, and knows how to be a good diplomat. And again, in order to be a good diplomat, you have to figure out what your intentions are, what the other side's intentions are, and you have to come to a compromise. But the compromise isn't based on a dollar value. And the trouble with President Trump is that he's deal making. He's not being a diplomat. He's deal making, and so it's a much more. I think. I mean, to operate a real estate deal, you need a lot of a lot of thinking about it and doing a lot of things. But what we saw, as you mentioned, Jay, we saw two bullies. I mean, again, who says to someone as monumental as President Zelensky, you need to thank us? I mean, who says this? I've never heard anything like this, and most people who have been involved in diplomacy or historians have never heard anything like it again. Anything like this. I mean, imagine that someone like Doris Kearns Goodwin was just probably shaking at the time because she, being a master of American presidents. And by the way, I'm reading No Ordinary Time, her biography about Franklin Roosevelt and the Roosevelts, and she's quite a great writer. But that's an aside.
If only we could have him back now. So let me go a step further and look a little outside the Oval Office incident, the scenario there. When I was in the Coast Guard, it was a military life-saving organization. It was interested in avoiding pollution and that sort of thing, investigating safety of life at sea, what have you. But as time went by, I noticed that, and this would be under the Clinton administration, I noticed that the Coast Guard and other military organizations were training their senior officers to be diplomats. They were including those in the military academies. They were giving them funding so they could conduct diplomatic events. And I have gone to some of those, and I have seen, diplomatic events organized by the Coast Guard, by military groups, where they're inviting their peers in other military groups, and they're trying to get together with them. They're trying to have diplomacy at that level. And that's what the APCSS in Waikiki, the Daniel K. Inouye Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies, is all about. It's about diplomacy. But now Trump is in, and he fires all the chiefs of staff and the senior chief of staff on reasons that are really unclear. Even his statement that he wanted to get rid of any officer who is into DEI, that's ridiculous. And he brings in loyalists who are not diplomatic. He doesn't care about diplomacy. Okay? Then I would also like to raise for you for discussion here today Trump's moves on the tariffs against Canada, Mexico, I don't know, and China, of course. So it's without notice. It's with a public statement that he's going to do this, and then he's going to double it and triple it. And if any of these countries impose countermeasures, he's going to go higher and higher. This last threat, which I think he backed off on, was 50% tariff against our best trading partner, Canada. That's ridiculous. Okay, and then he backs off, all within a 24-hour period, over and over again, with all these people. It's bullying to the nth degree. There's no friendliness, no ability to do diplomacy, in the French sense, in the sense we've been talking about, in the sense of Pax Americana. At the same time, he makes demands on Panama. He wants Panama. He hasn't dropped that, and he wants Greenland. He hasn't dropped that either. Imagine making public statements to the world without talking to them in any way that he wants those places. I think that's way off any kind of diplomacy, even if it was a legitimate request or expectation. And so all of these things seem to bear on what happened in the Oval Office. His bullying, his outrageous demands, his playing to the press, the audience, the public opinion, many of whom will agree whatever he says. Okay, and he has completely dropped the notion of a kinder, gentler, civilized conversation between either our allies or our adversaries, who he now makes our allies and insults our allies. To me, the first thing about diplomacy is don't insult somebody. It doesn't get you anywhere. It doesn't get you anywhere to tell him he should have a tie, or he's not being thankful, or he's being, quote, disrespectful. He did that a couple times. And all of this push against our most favored trading partner and Mexico, Canada and Mexico, his demands on Panama and Denmark and Greenland. So I sense that what you're saying it goes beyond what you're saying. He is never going to follow the norms of civilized international communications again. He's found this works for him, whether it's transactional or you put some other name on it. He's not going back. Do you agree?
Jay, I do agree, and the proof in the pudding is the stock market. Since he's taken over, and businessmen don't like to see this erratic behavior, and to go after if you're interested really in and this is what John Bolton said the other day, if you're interested in making agreements, you go into private rooms and you talk to political leaders and you say, look, I think is unfair, can we come to some sort of settlement about this? We're friends. And to go after countries like Canada or Denmark, or trying to incorporate Greenland, or trying to relitigate what Jimmy Carter so wonderfully did in Latin America, where people were really liking the United States, is counterproductive. And he's misunderstood history, and he's trying to become a 19th century imperialist again, but it's not the 19th century. There have been people, if you bark at people, they're going to bark back, and so this is the big problem. So he's not only creating a chaos in the Ukraine, but he's creating chaos, with these tariffs. And if people should break down the tariff. If you put a tariff on any goods, it's going to cost more when it gets into this country. And there was a woman I overheard today on CNN who was a representative in Michigan, House of Representatives, and she was talking about how she had people meeting with her at one of her congressional hearings, and people were outraged because they didn't vote for this. They didn't vote for an increase in goods based on the shenanigans of a really crazed person. And I think that, again, this goes back to Donald Trump not really being well educated in terms of diplomacy or in economics. And the people, if you're lacking in something and you're the head of a country, then what you do is you get someone. You get a George Kennan, you get a Henry Kissinger, you get a John Bolton, and you say to them, "What do you think?" And they come up with pretty good ideas. And then and if they don't, then you implement what what everyone, after you've listened to everyone in the room, and then you have many advisors. The problem is that with the Trump administration, I think this feeds into what you were saying, Jay, is you have a whole administration of yes men and women. And when that happens is you don't get the kind of diversity you want. And let me just say one thing about DEI. Look, when you're the head of any organization, and even in me in my small way, when I was working in education and I was running a program, you want to get the most diverse ideas that you can, so that you can implement things that are going to be good. And if you have people coming from different economic strata and different races and ethnicities and religions, there's a good chance you're going to hear different ideas because people were raised differently. And I mean, this going after DEI in kind of a veiled and sometimes not so veiled racist attack, and anti not only racist but anti-economic class, and and all sorts of things. And to the most recent thing that was shows how ludicrous this all is that to take away a 4-star general and replace them with a fewer star general, when this 4-star general was getting accolades all around, is it's just ludicrous. It's really ludicrous, and it's not logical. And that's why you have the markets in disarray. That's why you have prices in disarray. Everyone doesn't know what Trump is going to do next. And I think this, as John Bolton would say, this is not a product of thinking about um, doing this and then setting things in disarray so you could bring things back together in a better way. This is just doing things chaotically because you're not well schooled. Bottom line.
Yeah, let's talk about the risks involved. We're in a new era of non-diplomacy, anti-diplomacy, or maybe you want to call it transactional diplomacy, but it is not diplomacy as we have known it. And certainly Trump is practicing that now. It's a kind of bullying, threatening diplomacy. I mean, if you guys don't do what I'm saying, I'm going to blow the hell out of it, whatever. Remember, he said that a couple of times in the Middle East. And then it surprises him that Iran is not going to negotiate with him about non-proliferation. It surprises him. I don't know why. You really, in today's world, you can make threats, and he does, and gets away with it. I'm reminded in Pakistan, somebody unhappy with some political faction in Pakistan, they hijacked a train today. I don't know if you saw that, and with 400 people, all hostages now. So you're saying, my goodness, if they had some kind of problem, why couldn't they try to work that out instead of hijacking a train with 400 innocent people? But that's where we are. And so the whole thing about threatening Europe, you're on your own. Remember that one? And of course, Ukraine, I'm not going to help you. And it's not going to be, I think he said, it's not going to be a good time for you if I'm not going to help you. It's a threat. It's all a threat. And so when you have a threat, then you have Europe, talking about rearming with nuclear weapons. 2 or 3 countries that don't have nuclear weapons are going to try to get them. The ones that do have nuclear weapons, namely the UK and France, are threatening to use them and deploy them. And holy moly! So when you do threats, when you do bullying, when you do this caustic, toxic kind of conversation, you run the risk of war. I mean, larger war. And I think we have the risk of a larger war because of him in the Middle East and, of course, in Ukraine. And so my question to you, is there any conceivable analysis by which this kind of diplomacy could be in America's interest? Or are we exposing ourselves to World War III, or call it a war in which nuclear weapons are used?
You have had wonderful shows here about what's going on with Taiwan and China, with experts that have been, I've watched them. They've been absolutely great on ThinkTech Hawaii. But the problem is, as I see it, is that China's watching what we're doing with Ukraine, and will, the aftermath of this may be an invasion of Taiwan or more aggressive Chinese military moves, because they're well versed in realpolitik, and they have strategic objectives, and they have diplomacy which goes back several thousand years. And I mean, in other words, of course, right now it's under a Marxist-Leninist rubric, but still yet. And I think that one of the things that really this world order that you're referring to, Jay, was set up by the men and women who fought and won World War II in Europe, and in specifically what's been called the Greatest Generation in the United States. And Donald Trump is threatening this, and he sees things only through a monetary lens, hence his criticisms of NATO, some of which may be reasonable, but I see 2 things, and this is why I was a little bit more optimistic, even though I didn't vote for the man during his first administration, is that he's so unorthodox that the people around the world might be, put off and, kind of uneven, especially the dictators around the world. But what I've learned to discover is that, Donald Trump will make decisions based on the fact that President Kim or President Putin will flatter him, and then he'll want to be their friends. And that's not the way it works. That's not diplomacy, because one has to realize that each president is trying to do what's best for their country, understandably. And so you've got to work things out and think about what your strategy is. I mean, is your strategy Wilsonian? I mean, are you going for basic human rights? And or are you more Bismarckian and focus on realpolitik and stuff? And so, ironically, the one of the great diplomats was Joe Biden, because Joe Biden had principles, and one of his principles was that he did not want to have American servicemen in any war overseas. And despite the kind of the difficult withdrawal, he actually did this. And he reestablished our ties with NATO after 4 years of Trump attacking NATO. And he made it very clear, by sending warships into the Pacific, that he wasn't going to deal with any kind of craziness on the part of China. So, Joe Biden had these ideas, and it's because he was a diplomat and he was, a learned man from working in um, the Congress for so many years. But, you know, um, with the, I mean, Marco Rubio has the ability to become a diplomat. I mean, I saw him today and he was acting like a diplomat. But the problem is he's also a yes man and he has to please his boss. And
Yeah.
whenever you have an administration, and those, Jay, you were a prominent lawyer and a great, you had a law firm and stuff like this, and you don't want people, you don't want your clients saying yes to you all the time and lying, or saying things they don't believe in. And this should have been more prominent in the Republican primary, with Nikki Haley. I mean, she should have taken on Trump in a more direct way. I mean, she lost anyway, but at least she could have gone down with flying colors and honor.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, remember, she was the UN representative. So she knew about things international. She knew about the UN and the problems at the UN, and she could have been an important voice, but she wasn't, neither at the UN or when she ran or after. But we're about out of time, but I want to tell you I want to refresh your recollection about a short story and see your reaction to it. It seems to me that this is getting worse. With all pathological people, if they succeed at being pathological, that's the signal that they should be more pathological. And I think that's what we're having. To the extent that Trump ever knew about diplomacy, he doesn't care now. He's succeeded in his own way, in his own measure, at non-diplomacy, at special Trump bullying diplomacy. He's found his recipe. But there was an event that I would like to remind you about, and it's the story of Mark Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, a very experienced, well-educated, thoughtful man. Right out of that part of the military that was concerned, and I think it may be ending, about diplomacy. So after the insurrection of January 6th, Milley was very concerned that the Chinese would take that as a threat. They would take Trump as a threat, that if he could gain control of the government in a coup and an insurrection like that, he would attack China. And he wanted to ameliorate the tension between the US and China. So he called his counterpart on the telephone in China and gave him some comfort. And who knows whether that avoided a war or not, but it seemed like a very appropriate thing to do in the circumstances. After all, it was a real shock that there would be an insurrection in this country. We all remember that, most of us do. So he calls him without permission from Trump, who was still the president at the time, because the inauguration had not yet happened in 2021. And for this now, Trump hates him. Trump wants him tried for treason. Trump wants him executed. That's what he has done everything he can to undermine Milley, his reputation, and what he did. And now Trump should have made that call, or somebody with Trump's permission should have made that call. But Milley felt that he wasn't going to get the permission, and he had to make the call for the benefit, for the interest of the country. Your thoughts, your reactions to that story, Are we better off now than we were then, or are we worse?
I think we're much worse, and it's because of the kind of leadership we had under the former 4 years of Donald Trump, with generals like Milley. And you know as well as I do that the military is composed of many brilliant thinkers, and if you get to the position of admiral or general, I remember listening to
Hank Stackpole. No.
I listened to him. I heard all these experts from Stanford at the Punahou World International Center. And then Admiral Stockpole got up and talked about what was going on in the Pacific. This is a kind of a gathering, and he stole the show. He's brilliant, absolutely brilliant man. I'm sure he's not still in the Marine Corps, but he was absolutely brilliant. And of course, you have had on this show, General Bob Lee, and I always laugh at his name because, of course, the original Robert Lee, the head of the Confederates. So this is a man who is not only a general, but a nuclear engineer, and he protected Hawaii under the Lingle administration, and he's quite good at doing that. And so you have these brilliant generals and brilliant admirals, and you need to listen to them. And sometimes you can't listen to them, like as we talked about in terms of the Kennedys. You got to take your own ideas. But the problem that the answer to your question in a short form, Jay, is I don't think that, and John Bolton is the person that really says this quite eloquently. I don't think Donald Trump or JD Vance have a set of values and ideas that they're trying to put forth internationally and with diplomacy. And when you have guys that have access to our nuclear weapons, that's quite dangerous. If you don't have any idea about, what's going on in the world, and I think JD Vance probably does a bit more than Donald Trump, but you don't really have a good sense of what makes things tick, and you don't have a George Kennan, and you don't have a Henry Kissinger, and you don't have a John Bolton on your side, then you're really in trouble. And if where our president is in trouble, it's that's something. And I wanted to end this with my point of view is we elect a president. So when we are critical, you and I, and very critical of the current president, that's our right as Americans. But he was elected to be our president, and so I think Americans have to stop, you know, um, deleting, things about our elected representatives, because we do elect them, and we have the chance to unelect them. And hopefully, in 2 years, there'll be a surge of people who want to change the course. Because right now, as what you mentioned, Jay, from foreign policy, because we don't have diplomacy, to economics, where we have just crazy tariffs, to economic policy, where our stock market has taken a big dive. And all of these things are things that what our current president, said he was going to take care of in the first week of office. And he has been a dismal failure.
Let's leave it there. Thank you so much to our special guest, Dr. Carl Ackerman. I'm Jay Fidell, host of Global Connections. We've been discussing diplomacy and whether it has been lost under Trump. Thanks to our viewers for watching. We'll see you again soon for the next one. Aloha.
Aloha.